Welcome back to the Combat Citizen Trauma and Reintegration Podcast. I'm your host, Ryan Stanton, and as always, we do a deep dive into your trauma and reintegration. So also just wanted to say thank you to our sponsor, BattleBox, our hard-carrying case. You can travel anywhere with it, throw it off a roof. I've actually thrown it off a roof and it's great and it survives. So, and you can find them on battlebox.co and not com, but .co. Because there's another BattleBox out there I've seen, so just making sure you battlebox.co, and then you can email them at yourbattlebox@gmail.com. All right, so we have our next guest. His name is Angus, and I'll just let him talk about himself. Wonderful gentleman. So I want to introduce you. Welcome, Angus.
Hey Ryan, and thanks, and thanks for bringing me on the show. This is going to be fun.
Yeah, I've been looking forward to it for you and I have been looking forward to it for a couple of weeks, so it's pretty nice. So yeah, let's just start it off with question. Usually, what I'll do with question, we've talked about it before. Just kind of start off with your background and specifically just anything before you got into the military, and we'll go from there.
Yeah, so I grew up in South London. Genetically, I'm a bit of a mutt. So on my paternal side, we're sort of an English-Scottish combination, and on my maternal side, we're Finnish, dyed-in-the-wool Finns. So, and the reason I raise that is partly because I'm here in the US, and it jives nicely with what is an American, and also because. Culturally growing up, people don't. The Second World War has had a massive impact on modern history, and my mum's side, being Finnish, they were sort of fighting with the Germans because their big foe was Russia, and they were sort of, if you like, starved out by the Allied forces. So I grew up in a family that on one side was a lot of my uncles or distant uncles were wearing what we would see in the movies as a German stormtrooper uniform, and on my dad's side and my grandma's side we're in British uniforms. So culturally, that was, once I got into my late teens and 20s and I realized that was quite an interesting secret to harbor.
Sure, yeah.
Yeah. And then so fast forwarding to there, so I've always been very active, played a lot of sports. Family's a little bit dysfunctional, and I'm bringing that up because I know it's sort of an underlying or an undercurrent theme. Grew up in a sort of, my parents divorced in the 70s, which back then was a bit shameful, and under British law, prior to the, I think, early 70s, divorce was a criminal case tried in the criminal courts, not a civil case. Yeah, so there was a lot of social and legal implications of divorce. And so when my parents divorced, it was still a stigma. And then you fast forward to the 80s, when I was in high school, people's marriages were cracking up. So there's a lot of dysfunctional families. So I sort of floundered my way through high school, like a lot of people who end up in the military. Relied heavily on sports to get me through high school. Didn't really understand who I was as an individual, and then late 80s, early 90s, the UK went through a bunch of recessions, and I got into the real world and discovered that my high school education wasn't really going to cut it. So at the first opportunity, I steered myself into the military and joined the Royal Navy in the mid-90s. So I tried to do a bit more with my rugby career, but that wasn't really going to pay the bills. And I was smart enough to know that playing a contact sport, I was going to age out quite fast because it's the physical intensity and the impact on your body. And I was concerned about, well, what am I going to do professionally? And the military was an option for an extension of education, extension of sporting life. There's obviously the military component, but you don't really think about that. I just wanted to earn a salary, pay the bills, and try and better myself, really. And I did. And I'm going to be very honest, right up front, that the military did a lot of good for me, coming from my teenage years were pretty stressful, but the military did a heck of a lot of good for me. I think I was struggling. We had some stuff going on in our family and in my early 20s that were pretty horrendous. And I think I was suffering with a degree of trauma or post-traumatic stress even before I went into the military. And when I was young enough, in my 20s as a man, you just don't really acknowledge anything that's going on. You don't acknowledge emotion. You don't acknowledge pain. You just shut it all away.
Sure.
And the military did me wonders. It gave me a lot of things I needed in the world. And I wasn't in there for a long time. My barely scraped through 3 years. But in that time, I was served down in the South Atlantic, went all the way down to what we call the Falklands and everyone else calls the Malvinas, and then off to the Middle East for a little bit, and then over in the Baltic region. And then, that came to what the military did for me in terms of good, emotionally, physically, mentally, and so on, sort of backfired because it's an institution that relies on traditions and hierarchical behaviors. And when I got through naval college, I just went, wow, holy cow.
Yeah.
It gave me tools to do things. And they get on a ship and you're in a very, very hierarchical environment, which works for a lot of people. But what they unleashed in my brain, I couldn't activate. And I wanted to join another service. So I've joined this wrong service. I don't want to waste taxpayers' money. Let me get into, I want to join the Royal Marines because they're a part of the Royal Navy. They wouldn't let me go. And I said, well, can I transition to the Army? Wouldn't let me go. And I thought I was communicating this. Maybe I was, maybe I wasn't. But I got to a point of frustration where it sort of forced me out. And I was able to shorten my career and leave and then go back into college, got a degree, dual language degree in Chinese and French, and used more of what the military taught me in civilian life and going back to college in college life than I ever used within the military. And a lot of that stays with me today. A lot of what it gave me has carried me, fast forward 20 years, 25 years, has carried me through some really tough environments. So, that's subsequent to that. So I went 4-year college degree, graduated from there. And then within 2 months of graduation, I was running someone else's business operation in China. And ended up staying in China for 12 years. And then after that, moved to the US, and I'm in the US now. And in that transition, became a professional coach, for a sports coach, and I do coach education. And I'm now in sort of run my own business coaching, leadership coaching organization. So that's the last 35 years in a potted history in a nutshell for you.
It sounds like a lot, but sounds like the kids in the background are having fun.
Yeah, that's they're enjoying the show as much as I.
That's okay. I'm sure everybody is going to understand. Everybody's at home, everybody's remote. I've seen so many videos of people just, they're at home and they're in meetings with their bosses, and all of a sudden their kid just either comes to grabs their face, whatever. So we'll roll with it.
Yeah, we'll roll with it. I'm in a family home. Everyone here is working in a room, to your point, because everyone's dislocated. So there's a bunch of us here, including the kids. So the kids obviously enjoying the Christmas break, and every other room is taken with someone doing their business.
Well, everybody listening to this, I hope you understand. There's things that happen. So, wow. So you went. So you told us about your before the military. You talked about getting into the military. You talked about your broadly 30,000 foot view of your military career, and then pretty much what you're doing now. So. So I guess I'm kind of just want to go back into, so something that I was thinking about, so for before military and now, thinking about now, what is one thing you wish you had known before enlisting and going? Do you guys, is it called basic training?
Yeah, we call it basic training. Yeah.
Okay. So what is one thing that you wish you would have known before going in?
That's a really good question. Do you mean on a personal level or a professional level?
It could be anything, but more towards the military. Knowing something, like if somebody like a recruiter told you, or like you were able to research something or whatever. You wish you would have known that prior to going, and they would have helped you better experience.
Yeah. So in terms of longevity of career, I sort of wish I'd stuck with my original choice. So in terms of the Navy, so the Navy seemed the least military of all the military, in the sense that there was a lot more going on in terms of engineering and science, and things like navigation and all those things, which I really, really enjoyed. But what I underestimated was the amount of mathematics involved. And I've never been strong on mathematics. It's not a good suit of mine.
I agree.
And so whilst I could do navigational mathematics, and I can still do it now, and things like speed, time, distance calculations, I have a lot of fun with navigation, land navigation versus sea navigation. Even today, it's sort of a loose hobby, but the engineering and weapons engineering, marine engineering stuff, I could not wrap my head around that for love nor money. I just really struggled with it. And if I'd done, ask the right questions. The ability to ask questions is something we sort of seem to evolve as we mature, and maybe done a little bit more deeper research into other elements of the services, I'd have probably stayed longer.
Okay, so more just on your career choice, basically.
Yeah, so I was because I think what it flashed out was I didn't really know who I was as an individual. And, I would have probably, when I discovered the ethos of the Royal Marines and how they developed their people, I was fascinated by it. Biomechanics, the physical endurance stuff, the mental endurance stuff, not just the combat stuff. I know, we make the mistake, I think, a lot of us, of prejudging organizations, and we prejudge military by, it's just a bunch of jarheads, to use an American term, and so on. And there's reasons for that. But when I got under the skin of certain things, I was of a mindset that I didn't realize how much I enjoyed excellence as a concept, and how much I like stretching myself and pushing myself. And so at the outset, I wish I'd steered myself in a direction that was better suited to me as a person. But coming back to your original question, if I knew myself better, then I might have made a slightly different choice. I discovered more about myself in there. A heck of a lot about myself and what I could do. And society doesn't really prepare people for entering the military. So unless you come from a military family, didn't prepare me. I had people go, "Oh, good on you, mate. That's awesome." And don't let the door hit your ass on the way out. Why would you? Because in your local community, people go, "Why would you leave? Why would you leave here? Why do you want to do that?" And there's a weird thing about communities, that when you move out of your community to go and better yourself, it has a strange impact on the people around you. I had a lot of people never speak to me again because I chose to leave our, red brick environment and go and do something else out in the world. And then I had other people who became friends, because they went, "Man, that's really cool. Good for you. I don't have the courage to go and do that." So we don't get prepared. So as I said, unless we come out of a military family or military backgrounds, you don't get prepared for it. So you have to do your own research. You have to try and understand what you're going into. And recruiters for the military are not like recruiters in Civvy Street. who are doing it for a bonus. They'll get money out of it. Recruiters in the military just need to get butts on seats. And so
Right.
if they can get you to sign up and fill a gap, they've done their job. They're not really that fast. They want warm bodies. I've been a bit flippant, but warm bodies, right?
Yeah.
They can steer. And even when I was in basic training, I think I managed to get into the branch I wanted to go into, which was the communications, because there was an option there to become a linguist. I love doing languages.
Oh, nice.
And then learn about, technical side of communications, radio, satellite, all that kind of stuff. That was a burgeoning branch in the Royal Navy. So I loved that. But even within basic training, I was noticing how people get steered still through basic training into other avenues.
Well, yeah, I mean, because ultimately the experience itself is, I mean, as you said, could be, it's completely different than people expect. And, if they're not prepared, it could be completely shocking. And so their original plan, or they could be steered to something else because, they're not in the right mindset, to go where they want to go. They're just like, oh, I'm here. Let's just get this done.
Well, yeah, and I was pretty clear in my own mind why I needed to do this. I wanted to get out of an environment and I wanted to better myself. So I was sort of making my own choices. But during basic training, I met a bunch of people who came from parts of the UK that were depressed. And they hated everything. And I said, why are you here? And they said, well, there's no jobs where I live. I'm faced with, canning dog food in a factory for the next 10 to 15 years or joining the military. And I have no interest in being in the military, but it's going to give me a paycheck and it's going to give me a standard of living. And it was culturally, to me, that was being from, the south of England is always perceived to be wealthier than the north of England. And, and there's some reality in that. But I didn't realize culturally that people like that existed. I thought that was a thing of the past. Right now, you fast forward today, and in the last 5 years or more, last 2 election cycles, people are talking a lot more about wealth gaps or poverty gaps, and number of people in poverty, and it's a theme that's reoccurring. But way back when I was young and dumb in my 20s, to come across people who were signing up to join the armed forces just because it's a job,
sure,
and it gets them out of poverty. Gets them out of the back streets of the hood into a life that gives them some prospect of a future. That to me was a real wow moment.
Did you find there was a lot of people like that then when you went through basic training, or was it just kind of a, here and there?
That's a good question. I reckon 1 in 2.
Wow.
Yeah. People from the Industrial Revolution, cities like Manchester and Newcastle and Liverpool, that had industry, that thrived on industry post Industrial Revolution, post World War One, and then all those industries, textile manufacturing, mining, just disappeared. By the time you fast forward to the late 80s, early 90s, because they've gone overseas, because the standards of living in the UK are so much higher. All the stuff you've heard in the last election cycles here. So all those traditional industries disappear overseas, and what that leaves behind is a vacuum and an employment vacuum, because not all these people, education doesn't necessarily catch up. So you've got people out of parts of the UK who go, well, like me, my high school education hasn't really cut it. I don't have a college degree, and and there's a little soapbox I like to get on, right? The way businesses function. If you don't have a college degree, then you are of no value. And we've sort of over the years turned our back on apprenticeships and functional internships, which brings issues to society in other areas. But Yeah, I would say 1 in 2 of the people looking back who are around me, and so not at Naval College, obviously that was a different experience, but in basic training as a rating, yeah, I would say 1 in 2 were there just because it was a better option than what they were in before. And I've heard a few backstories. I've managed to connect with a few people, you know, in the last few years, and discovered a little bit more about where some of my cohorts came from. And you know, some obviously sadly have died, some are still around, some they had different trajectories in their pathways, and you know, a lot of them ultimately migrated back to where they came from, and to the theme of this show, struggle with the transition. And a lot more comes out as you know, history, our personal histories move forward, and you mature and you get to speak to people about stuff. A lot of them had, like myself, had issues going in. I think what the military is very good at is allowing you to contain those issues.
Yeah.
What it's not so good at is allowing you to address those issues.
Yeah, I agree. You know, with a lot of the things that I personally deal with, it's interesting because, you know, when you come out of the military, you have, I mean, it's weird because it's like a delayed reaction of, you know, you get out and however long it takes for someone to start feeling, you know, whether it's PTSD or it's, you know, separation anxiety or all these things. It's interesting because, you know, we all experience things differently. But then we don't really know how to deal with it because we really haven't been shown how to deal with it, because, you know, ultimately I don't think we wholeheartedly understand, you know, how to deal with ourselves when we're outside of the military. I know there's a lot of organizations and people that are trying to better that, but it's interesting because some of the people I've talked to with conversation, like, you know, how they were, and this is the reason why I asked these questions, is how you were before the military, how you were in the military, and how you are after the military, because there's so much difference between who you were before and who you are now, and then how we all deal with, you know, the stress or the anxiety or the all these things that come out of the military. But yeah, I don't think we have a good solid lead on how to always deal with ourselves.
Yeah, I think that's really valid, and it's yeah. And how do I respond to that? Because you know, our societies, what do they equip us for? Right, our parents tell us to go to school, assuming we've got both or one that are in a position to get us to go to school. So society says you have to go to school, better yourself, then leave school, get a job, get a mortgage, get married, and just get on with life, and that's it. And if you stick your head above the parapet, then you're a snowflake, because you know, because you're daring to ask a question, or because you're daring to be different, or you're trying to be different. And the requirements of society, and the military is a microcosm of society, is the requirements generally of society are around conformity, right? That's why people like Socrates ultimately got stoned to death, because he was questioning, you know, well, maybe we could be different, or maybe we could be better, you know, through discussion. But it's what the military does for you. It takes you and shapes you and hones you into a very functional human being, fit for purpose. Now, but the emotional content of that is not necessarily a driving factor or a driving force. And if you look at the first sort of recorded cases of PTSD, for example, I think that goes back to the 1800s, and yet we're still surprised by it today. So, you know, let's advance ourselves. You know, as we're supposed to be in the 21st century, and we're supposed to be more advanced human beings, and yet we don't embrace something that's been around for a long time. You know, because we don't like to speak to emotions, we don't like to speak to mental trauma, because society has wrapped stigma around it.
Mhm. Yeah, that's what I was gonna say. It's a stigma that is tough to deal with.
Yeah, and so if I'm going to be a little bit controversial here, is it the purpose of the military to enable those conversations? Because in the military, then before I came on this show, I was talking with a friend of mine, and you said you've got people in the military, you can divide them into two silos. You've got those who go into combat and those who don't, in very broad terms.
Right.
And then if you stick someone in a submarine, right, the very fact of going in a submarine under the water for 3 or 4 months it's like going into space for 3 or 4 months. Am I going to come back? Forget the combat side of things. It's a traumatic experience where you're shutting down or restricting or confining normal human senses and sensibilities. And but we glamorize. We don't talk to that. We glamorize things like Top Gun pilots, right?
Yeah.
But then you look at the very fact of, I was coaching a group of young men in the US just recently, about a year ago, all of them around 18, 19. And I said, do you realize your country's been at war all your life, your whole life, and only 2 of them knew that? Only 2 out of a group of 20 said, oh yeah, I'm aware of that. And when you go, holy cow, how do you not know? Yeah.
Yeah. Huh.
So I think in terms of the theme of this show, preparation, prior preparation and planning, to use a military or analogy, is we just repeat. Human nature repeats itself, and therefore, coming back to the emotional piece. Did the military help me in my transition? No. Had I earned the right to it? Probably not in their eyes. But then I asked the question, do they need to? Why should they?
Yeah. I was thinking about, so when I was in, so one of the last assignments that I was in, it was medical readiness NCO. And, I worked with the mental health office, and there's a lot of guys that were dealing with issues, right? They're dealing with whatever. I mean, anxiety, PTSD, all this stuff, anger, frustration. But it was interesting because, and I know we touched on this a little earlier, but is that the conversations with these soldiers were more on the end of, how can we make you better so that you can continue in the mission, what your job is and whatnot. And I guess where I'm trying to go with there is that do we a lot of times I saw that we just made them better for that time being, but then didn't make them better necessarily overall. And then they get out of the military and they're like, what am I supposed to do? And so they're fully dealing with their issues, and they're trying to figure out, where they go next, what they do next, and a lot of the resources. And this is one of the things that I'm trying to shed a light on, is that a lot of those resources they don't know about, and they don't know who to talk to, especially because they've been in the military. They've been molded into a certain individual, and now they have these issues, and they don't know how to deal with it outside the military because, like I said, who you are before the military is completely different than who you are outside the military. And now you have to kind of rectify that and try to figure out how to be outside of the military in the civilian sector.
Yeah, and that's a really good set of points to raise. So on a personal level, I think before I went into the military, I was a good person. And when I came out, I was a better person.
Sure.
In very simple terms. The and I've over the years had a lot of sympathy with people who've spent time either in the military or law enforcement or in any first responder role. I've a lot of friends over the years who've been doctors, nurses, as well as police officers or military types. And as there's common themes of like gallows humor and characteristics, how we evolve our characters and personalities because we've been in those environments. And those you transition. I've been blessed. I've been all around the world. Police officers and army folks in China are very similar in their behaviours to those over here, people we know. It's that sense of having respect for someone who's put themselves through a process seems to transition worldwide. Now, equally, when I became first aware of post-traumatic stress disorder was in friends I made who were executives in business, civilian business, when I was overseas in an expatriate environment. And guys used to come and speak to me and offload their problems. I said, "Why are you speaking to me?" And they said, "You look like you understand." And that's a very subjective set of parameters to make a decision on for what is ultimately a very, very important conversation.
Sure.
And some of them were, these are people getting six-figure salaries, responsible, very high-ranking positions in civilian life, and they were in mentally and emotionally in a very, very bad way. Where am I going with this thought process, right, is coming back around to an earlier question is about what do you know better? I think if we knew what we were walking into, probably a lot more people wouldn't go into the services. And then you're probably back to a space when you look at geopolitically, US foreign policy, for example, then you're into a space of, well, do we have to then have mandatory conscriptions?
Because if you go and so it kind of goes back. So knowing how so like if I were to find out, like if I'm doing my research, right, and I'm looking at the position or the MOS or whatever that I want to do in the military, and then I find out, okay, so that's cool, I want to do that. But I don't necessarily think, maybe if I haven't been, like I don't have a military family or whatever background, that kind of stuff, and I'm just looking and getting in the military because of the education piece, I'm not necessarily thinking of the after effects, like when I get out of the military, right? But I think if people actually knew that like you're sitting in the recruiter's office and the recruiter goes, okay, so I'm just gonna let you know, when you get in the military, you're gonna experience this. You're gonna go through this in the basic training. And then you're gonna experience, for example, with me, rank differences, how people treat you in the military because you're a certain rank. And then you're going to go deploy. If you deploy, you go somewhere else. Now you're going to deal with that. You're going to come back, and then you may experience PTSD. You may experience anger. You may experience this. And then when you get out of the military, you're going to feel disconnected, blah, blah, blah. I don't think I would go in the military if I had that, if I got that. I mean, I can't honestly say exactly, but I mean, I think if a recruiter laid it out like that, and to make sense, I think you'd have to transcribe, transcription or whatever for getting people in the military, because they're not going to want to go through that, right?
Yeah. Yes.
It's a huge, it's a huge idea, but do we want to know that before we go in the military?
Right. And there's an interesting theme here for me, because as I said, I am sympathetic, even though I might not sound sympathetic. I'm sympathetic to these transitions, right? And I can remember when I left, and I had no idea how much I'd changed. I had no concept of how much I'd changed until I came out and was back in civic street. and I signed up for university, and I went to university, and I just went, holy cow.
You,
Like,
you,
holy cow.
do you find out you thought you thought differently, or
Thought differently, behaved differently, you know, and you have to applaud in terms of basic training, whether we like it or not, whether we're prepared for it or not. You know, in some senses, basic training it reshapes you.
yeah,
It really does, and you know, there's whole organizations behind the reshaping and the retraining of young people to make them militarily functional.
sure,
Yeah, and there's no organizations that I've seen in the commercial world that do that. No one spends time on, you know, retraining people unless they, yeah, the expectation is you train yourself, you go and get a qualification, and then you fight tooth and nail to get a job. And it's now the better companies out there are doing it, but no one does it on the scale that the military does.
no, I mean, because it's a more, you know, I don't know if this is the right term or not to use, but somebody explained it to me one time, is that, you know, they're breaking you down, you know, like not, I would say stripping the civilian out of you, but they're breaking down the civilian in you, and then they're rebuilding you up into the image of what a military is, and then that's who you are now. um, and it's, I think a lot of times the only people that really know out, you know, that you're different are people that, you know, your family, your friends, or whatever. Because I've had family, you're like, Ryan, you're different. Like, you're either just like my sister and I, we don't talk very often because I am very direct. You know, before the military, I was more kind of on the passive, you know, the passive end. And now I'm more the direct end. So we're getting things, you know, conversation and getting things done, or whatever. But yeah, I mean, it goes back to that. It's like breaking of you and building you back up.
Yeah, and to that point, in coming back to the piece about why I applaud my experience, is I don't think I would have got through my commercial experiences over in China without that military background.
Sure.
And so, in the phrase "birds of a feather flock together," I wasn't in a big city, an international city in the early days like Shanghai or Beijing. I was in a second-tier city. You know, I started out in Nanjing, and
Okay.
Anyone who was in business, who'd been in the military, it doesn't matter how long or short your service was, we all connected very, very quickly. And in these dislocated environments, like an expatriate position, those are the people who seem to manage a lot better than folks who'd come out from mainstream life. You know, so, and yeah. I quite cynically, I used to sort of laugh a bit at, you know, young professionals in their 30s who were given a senior management or an executive position in the company just because they were willing to go to China, and they could not cope. They would break down really, really fast. I saw a lot of marriages go to the wall. I saw a lot of lifestyles go to the wall, people drinking, drug taking, you know, self-abuse. Is not everyone. This isn't an articulation of what civilian expatriates are like.
Sure.
But what I'm saying is that what the military does well is creates you fit for purpose, and you can if you're willing. And I think this is the point, and in the theme of this show around transitions, you have to be willing to adapt yourself to the environment. Right? If I give you a hammer and a saw and a set of carpentry tools, and it teaches you how to be a good carpenter, you've actually got to be willing to be the carpenter. It's not going to happen without you know, taking some of that drive and driving it into that vocational profession that you choose. And so, and civilian life doesn't do that. Except in, you know, areas that are, you know, like law enforcement or other first responder areas. Some of the most humane people I've met have been of the military.
Sure.
So but coming back to the piece where was I different? I think I'm definitely, my family noticed it, to your point, my family noticed it. It equipped me to really become a better person. It equipped me to face challenges that as I just articulated, I don't think I would have got through those challenges without even that time spent in the military that pushed and pulled me into a shape that I probably needed. But I tell you what, is when I see the state of people who've done a longer service, so let's say 10 plus years, a lot of them are cynical and bitter, and I'm glad I didn't stay. So I do not regret exiting my career at that early stage. I sometimes have regrets about not having tried harder to achieve more, because when I came out, I did achieve a heck of a lot in my life. So the person I knew I've become today has done a lot more subsequent than I did. So there's sort of that little bit of, I talk to my career with a bit of shame, I suppose, or a bit of guilt on the subject of PTSD or mental health issues. Those are two emotions that we are very good at self-generating.
Sure.
And I think that's sort of, I look back and thought, I could have done better. And I sort of let myself down a bit in that sense. But I'm glad I didn't, because coming back to that point, there's a lot of people out there who are an absolute mess.
It's interesting because kind of going back to the family thing is those that notice that something is going on tend to, I don't know, they can either be a huge inspiration for the individual to change, or it can be somewhat of, I don't want to say deterrent, but it's something, they're like, because the service member, whether they recognize or they accept that they're changed, whether they accept that they need to go do something, or in his classic example, so being on deployment, the guys that were in, that they were consistently going into combat, they were those kind of things, their coping mechanisms were completely different than those individuals that didn't do that. Like, say for instance, the ones that you talked about earlier, the ones that go into combat and the ones that don't go into combat, right? And so you get out, somebody notices those differences. Do you change your habits because someone's noticed that? Like with someone that's going in, into combat, their coping mechanisms are drinking or whatever, and someone notices that, do they want to change or do they not change? I think that's a bigger topic, as well too, but
right.
A lot of things in there, but
so that's interesting, because I never saw combat. I was in combat zones. I remember down in the Middle East, we were expecting to go to war, and so going, man, I'm scratching my head now. These are long time ago memories, Straits of Hormuz, but I remember us being threatened by the Yemenis. And then we are on the way in, and we're doing biological chemical warfare training as a defense mechanism, because we are expecting to be hit with biological or chemical weapons. Now, just the very act of going through that, not forget engaging with it, the very act of going through it is not something you're going to do in your civilian life.
Right.
And I remember standing on the deck of this ship going, that's significant. How do you respond?
Right.
And as when you're on a ship, there's no option for drinking and smoking. So your coping mechanisms are, you internalize it, because we're all tough military dudes. So you're not going to tell your mate, oh fuck, I'm scared. Oh, sorry. You're not going to tell your mate. You're not going to tell
on the
your
podcast. I don't know what it's with the kids.
You're not going to tell your mates, I'm scared, because you are, but it's not, that's not a requisite. We can't speak to those internal emotions.
Well, and it also goes with too, is you not wanting to say something and internalizing it in the military, then that hardens in self that you don't want to do that outside of the military. And it's more difficult to chat about that because you've now internalized it so much that you don't know how to talk about it.
Well, and in a good way, as I said, it gave me an edge, but in a bad way, it gave me an edge. And I can be very unforgiving of people in a way. So I'm very big on intentional learning, and I'm very big on helping people. I love helping people. And as a coach, I wouldn't be a coach, but there's still a steely edge in there that I can, if people are not delivering, or struggling to deliver, I can come down on them quite hard. And I've been through some processes, people I trust, athletes that I've coached, my wife, and outside of my wife, I'm doing this podcast with you to a whole bunch of strangers, and I've known you twice, and I'm talking about stuff with you that I can't even talk with my family about. And go figure, right? And I'm sure I'm not the only one who's been through that. But I've been to, with people I've worked with, and I said, look, I want to let you know that I can come across as really, really hard. And in an operational sense, I can come out like really hard. And it is because I know we're task oriented. So when I get task oriented, we're going to deliver, right?
Right.
But that doesn't mean I'm unkind, and it doesn't mean I'm inhuman. But then as I evolved and became more mature, when you go in the military, you don't talk to things like, are you an introvert or an expert? You don't talk about chemical makeup of your brain versus my brain. We don't speak to things like, you have that outcome is going to create this reaction, cause and effect. All that stuff that would probably better benefit us. We don't speak to it. We shy away from it. Because vulnerability is strength, not weakness. But as humans, we see vulnerability as weakness that can be exploited. So it's easier to lock it away and not address it than have the strength to speak to it. And we need the leadership to be able to do that so the others can follow.
Yeah, because a lot of times to get something done, we have to be so task oriented. And in the military, we're task oriented to get something done, is what I meant. And so that can be, I understand what you're saying as far as with other people too, because I've been so task oriented and getting things done, that the communication with civilians tends to be a little bit shorter, because I'm like, hey, I want this done now. And it doesn't get done, and I find out that I have to have conversation with my wife, because she's like, just calm down. Just step back and take a look at the big picture, and then figure out why that happened, and then move forward. Versus, if I had a soldier of mine that was, fucking up, basically, then I would be straight on them, be like, hey, what are you doing? And that compassion wasn't necessarily there. And I don't know if about what it's doing now in the military as it's transitioning or whatever, but those kinds of conversations led to now, when I'm short with my wife or short with friends or whatever, that it's because of that, that training, that direction that you were placed in, that your mindset was placed in.
Yeah. 100%. I'm actually, and listening to you speak, I'm very intolerant of wastage, which should be great for any business, because businesses need to run lean. And when it comes to, operationally, I know that people can deliver more than they think they can. And so, one of the things I've enjoyed over the years in civilian life is achieving more with less, right? And and I had very little reliance on material wealth, very little reliance on material things. And the military gave me the ability to achieve and push myself. But then the negative is that it clicked or kicked a bunch of triggers where I felt, to validate myself, this need to constantly overperform, constantly overachieve. And you know, so when I went back to college, and I said, you know what, the whole world, China seems to be taking a stake in the world. So if I'm leaving the military, if I'm resigning my commission to do something, I want to do something different. So I'm going to go and learn Chinese. That's what it gave me, that positive ability. I can do this. I can nail this language. The flip side is the sort of, you know, and there's a little bit of old school in UK culture. I hadn't been to university, so when I was at Naval College, you're not one of us because you didn't go to university. I didn't come from a middle class background, white collar background, so you're not really one of us. You just will tolerate you being here, and you sort of sense some of that. And I can't really articulate it, but there's sort of that, you know, society creates snobbery anyway.
Sure.
It's just human nature. But then the positive, I suppose, it's a positive and a negative, is that sense of when I went to college, they said, well, Chinese is really hard and you don't come from a good school and yada, yada, yada. Are you sure you can do this? I got really mad. So it became an act of defiance that not only will I do this, I'm now going to actually tack on another subject. So instead of being bilingual, I'm going to be trilingual. And I'm going to flip the bird to all of you. I'm going to flip the bird to the world. Right now, fast forward 20 years, and one of my professional colleagues said, "Do you get fixated on stuff?" And I go, "No." And she said, "Yes, you do. You get fixated on stuff." And that became a negative, because when I sat back and reflected, I went, "Bloody hell, she's right, man. I get like a dog on a bone, and when I get that bone between my teeth, I will chew it and chew it and chew it till I've destroyed it." And that's, you know, for people, particularly if they've been combat vets or whatever, you know, that becomes a mechanism that we don't necessarily know how to turn off. You know, and I've seen it in friends of mine. I remember, you know, a couple of friends from way back when. One had been in Somalia, the other one, a bit older, had been in Vietnam. Right, on the age of 18, he was in Vietnam on his 18th birthday. Right, and another friend of mine on his 18th birthday was in the Falklands, guy I played rugby with. And then a fellow I interviewed on my own podcast, a US Marine, he was in Iraq at the age of 18, 19. Right? Nice. And all of them had lost someone or lost something. And all of them had that same challenge of the inability to switch off that intensity. And when, you know, so it's, and all the and they're all male, I'll be honest. I haven't had these conversations with female military but all men the fella in Somalia, he was just, I loved him to bits, but he really struggled even to have a relationship with his mates, let alone his family. And he was so fixated and so intent on overachieving and over delivering. And it's sort of that act of, is it deliberate or unintentional defiance? Sure. It is, for me personally, was a byproduct that I wasn't equipped to manage.
You know, it's interesting because you know, I think a lot of that training becomes part of, definitely becomes part of your makeup, and being able to turn it off or being able to switch it off, or however you want to just say that. Yeah, it does become a challenge. I mean, I personally have experienced that, to where, you know, you want to shut that off. And then, you know, dealing in business, particularly dealing with other business owners or dealing with other, or just customers, and being able to shut that down and be like, okay, well, I'm going to, you know, create, you ultimately have to, like, and I've figured this part out, is you ultimately have to create a different persona for yourself, because if you can't present yourself as a military person to somebody else, because I mean, you can, and you can't, because, you know, those parts of you that you can't shut off are not, I don't want to say desirable, but they're not necessarily pieces of you that somebody else is going to accept, right? And so I've ultimately created persona for my business that any communication, anything, like there's times where on my own, digress here, but on my own business page, that I'll write a post out, or like all on my own, you know, like Facebook page or whatever. And then I realize I have clients on there. I don't want to write this. I mean, I don't want to push send, or I don't want to, you know, push publish or whatever.
Yeah.
And delete it, because my mindset is, you fucked up or there's something stupid. I want to say it, but I can't, because I have to look back and go, you know what? I have to go back into that persona, because everybody sees me that way. They don't want to see me as the soldier, you know.
Well, and there's a couple of good points there. And over the years, I've looked back at this, and your life in the military accelerates executive function, right? And the challenge that has for civilians is your civilian career pathway. You will do stuff in the military just through executive functioning alone. Forget everything else, that you will never be able to do in a civilian organization unless you're in the C-suite, CEO, CFO. So it equips you and accelerates you mentally and emotionally at a very young age into a headspace that you won't see again or be able to use again until you're in your 40s, 50s or later. You know, and when you look at your average C-suite and your average US corporation and who's populating that, when you're in your late 20s or your 30s or even your early 40s, and you've transitioned out of the military, and you look at a civilian pathway and you go, do I really want to do that? Sure. Because you're not allowed to use it. So I think part of the pain is we don't know how to articulate what we have as skill sets or abilities, or translate them or interpret them for civilians. So we become like I don't know how much you know about art, if you the scream, you know, internally we're all bloody screaming because we're not taught to transition. We're not taught that how to articulate those abilities and reinterpret or recalibrate those for civilian life. And then you get into a civilian situation, and I think back to my friend who was the guy who'd been in Somalia, and the other guy had been in Iraq, and look at those two dudes and go, you guys have got so much good going on, but in Civvy Street, it's get on your desk, sit behind your desk, shuffle your paper around, do your job, and mind your P's and Q's till we're ready to speak to you.
Right.
You're going to sit there, and that is soul destroying, man. Absolutely. So I couldn't go through that. I've continually in my professional career avoided that, because I'm going to go and work in smaller enterprises where I can use that functional ability to good. Otherwise, that would destroy me. And, right. You know, and I've been very conscious and deliberate in that, because I respect people who come out of the military and achieve it, because I don't know how they do. And to the other point, you know, when you talk about speaking with civilians, is we do not live in totalitarian societies, or you know, or a military junta environment. So therefore, you know, civil society does not enjoy looking at the underbelly of society.
No,
they don't. It's not something they're equipped to. You know, if you look at it in the 80-20 framework, 80% of people shy away from the stuff that we choose to engage with, but just by signing up for a time in a military service. So why would we expect them to engage with us when we come out?
I agree.
And I'm not excusing the behavior. I think we are sometimes the architects of our own pain, because I remember, the friend of mine on his 18th, I remember him telling me, he said, on my 18th birthday, and he wasn't American, he's Australian. On my 18th birthday, I was pulling the trigger on claymores in Vietnam. Right.
Okay.
Now that's serious doo-doo, man. And that stayed with him his whole life. Right. And he, coming back to Oz, he couldn't understand how no one knew. What do you mean Vietnam? Where's Vietnam? Right. And he still had to pay $1 for a cup of coffee at McDonald's like everyone else. Right. And so you fast forward to now, the commercial scale of the military-industrial project, military-industrial complex, is so large and so far-reaching in US society that we're aware of it because it's spilling over into civilian society.
Sure.
And there's probably, one or two steps removed from someone who's in a bad position because of their time in the military-industrial complex. Now, I'm not bagging the military-industrial complex. It's just because it's so big now and so far-reaching.
Yeah.
Coming back to my original thought, when we're inside those institutions, we think we're doing something, we're serving an ideology, or we're doing good for society, whatever our banner is that we charge around underneath. We have to learn to understand that civvies basically don't care. They don't care, and they don't want to engage with it, and it's not something they can comprehend. And we're all out there crying out for them to understand, and they just don't, can't, or won't. And that's a bitter pill to swallow.
Yeah. God, there's a lot of stuff we can unpack here.
Yeah, as you could tell, I've been thinking about this.
We're gonna, so this is what I've been doing with the people that I've been bringing on, because ultimately there's a lot of stuff. There's a lot of conversation about transition. We're talking about a lot about mindset and the industrial, military industrial complex and the attitudes and all that. There's a lot of stuff that could be unpacked ultimately. And so I've been having more conversations than just one with people. So I've been bringing them on for a couple of episodes, or, however that works out, because there's a lot of stuff. I mean, we have just touched on, because each of us are finding out our experiences, color, whatever, is going on in our lives. And just by talking with you, there seems to be a lot that could be talked about. So, yeah, I think I'd like to have more conversations if that works out for you.
Yeah, I'd love to come back. Yeah. As you can tell, I'm actually passionate about this subject because I think it was, as I said, my time in China that allowed me to look back at my time in the military and then recognize people. And then I thought I can actually help people. And I made it a deliberate part of my life. I've got some empathy with you. I may not have been in a combat heavy environment, but it doesn't matter whether you've been combat or non-combat. I still have empathy with what you're going through in your non-military life, in your transition. And I made it a deliberate part of my life. If I can help someone, I'll help them. And that's what actually accelerated me into a coaching career, business coaching and sports coaching. So I run both in tandem because it's all about transforming and helping people. Now, one of the things you see today in modern business, the ones that are going to survive the COVID era and the ones that are going to survive and have a legacy, business legacy they can be proud of, are the ones that are looking after mental well-being. And they're the ones that are creating those cultures of awareness and, enabling people to be fit for purpose, not just physically, but emotionally and mentally. And I really enjoy helping those organizations along. I've set myself up professionally. And even when I got married, I said to my wife, look, you deserve to know that I'd like to do this because I like to help people. And she's been really good about it because it just sort of landed in my lap. And, when those dudes were coming out and speaking about their stuff, and they would, and at the back of it, I'd say, well, how did I help you? And they said, man, just having someone to talk to who can just understand even a fraction of what's going on inside makes a difference. And so that for me is something that if I was going to give a bit of advice to people who are transitioning is, number one, don't expect the rest of the world to understand.
Yeah.
Because the rest of the world's too busy trying to lead their own life and pay their own bills. Sadly, in some senses, we live in a transactional society, and therefore, if you're not a positive transaction, you're not going to get what you need out of society, which is a sad fact of life. Point number two, before you go, do your homework, right? Make sure you know what you want to do. And don't underestimate the workload that's involved, not just in the transition, but the development of whatever you want to do professionally. It's a job of work. It's a labor of love. And you've got to be emotionally and mentally ready for that. And then number three, if you're screaming on the inside, then find someone. Find someone. It doesn't matter if you like what they say, but find someone you can trust, that you can speak to, and your mentor will change, right? They will change over time as you change, but that's okay. Don't be ashamed of it. Don't carry guilt. Don't carry shame, but find someone you can trust to speak to, because if you don't, eventually it's like a bloody pot of macaroni and cheese that you've left on the oven too long. It's going to boil over.
Sure.
And if you can't afford insurance, and you can't afford medical, and you can't find counseling, and you can't pay for a recruiter, which is what a lot of people have to do in this transactional world we live in, then find someone you can trust to speak to, who's willing to listen to you. But don't be all hard about it. Try and make it an engagement. It's a two-way street. So you and I having a conversation, don't make it a one-way street. Be willing to answer questions as a trade-off for finding the right mentor to listen to you.
Sure. Yeah, I like that last point. And I think a lot of times people don't necessarily know to reach out to people. Or even if they did, resources wise, they don't know what the resources are. Like to finish on this, but I've been using the Wounded Warrior program. They have a talk program, which they have a certain, like you can talk for 3 months on one subject, and then just chat with somebody weekly. And that way you can have, a check-in 20 minutes, to see how you're doing, those kind of things. So those kinds of programs are out there. It's just my goal on this podcast is also getting those resources out to people. So if anybody that's listening, and I'll try to put some things into the comments, a description, is there's a lot of things out there. We just have to get them to you. People just need to know what these are.
100%. And absolutely. So
well, wonderful.
I hope this was of value to you, Ryan. I really appreciate you inviting me on the show.
Yeah, I really appreciate you jumping on the show. Like I said, we'll definitely have you more, and that way we can harvest all the good and the information as we're talking about transition for soldiers. So, I really appreciate you coming on the show, and thank you everybody for listening. I wholeheartedly feel that you should take the last 3 points that Angus spoke about, and I'll try to transcribe those and put those in the comments as well, as advice for you guys. So all in all, thank you for listening. Thank you for subscribing, and thank you for sharing. Ultimately, the only way that we can get this message out there and the stories and experiences of soldiers is for you to get the word out. And that's through what you do by either sharing it or subscribing or whatever you do. So thank you very much, everybody. And this has been wonderful, and we'll chat with you later.
Cool. Thanks, man.